You're putting a seal of authority on
right.
Rome in most cases. You're saying that they have the right to determine whether your practices are licit or not.
And I'm pretty sure the Orthodox would disagree.
And the Orthodox would disagree, and the Anglican Church would disagree. And
the Anglican do have female bishops.
Yeah. Within the Anglican communion, of course, we do have female priests and female bishops, and those are within their jurisdiction valid and licit. Right? There's no question about that. They are done according to their own laws. And so these questions are often very, very tricky, especially when it comes to relationships in between jurisdictions, right? Now, because we have a fairly broad understanding of both validity and licitness, we have a tendency to regard with respect and to afford to bishops and priests and deacons from other jurisdictions a great deal of leeway. So, for example, to refer to one of the practices that is often, though not always, observed in the Apostolic Johannite Church, a bishop administers the Eucharist to herself at the altar, no matter who's celebrating. So, for example, if Father Donald or Father Tony or anybody else is celebrating the liturgy and His Eminence is in the congregation, when it comes time to administer the Eucharist to the faithful, His Eminence will come up and administer for himself. It doesn't have to; it's not an obligation, and often we do choose to receive communion rather than administer it to ourselves. But if we also have visiting clergy, if we have visiting bishops, we often will afford them that respect as well, because we consider their orders to be valid. Now, that doesn't make them AJC bishops, right? That doesn't mean that we're handing over authority to them. It's that we respect the validity of a broad range of orders. I mean, if Pope Francis is sitting in the congregation at an AJC Mass, I'm not sure any of us are going to tell him that his orders aren't valid and that he can't administer the Eucharist to himself. So I think that this extends also to our brother and sister independent churches and Gnostic churches and things like that.
I was just going to add, it's worth noting, and this goes to everybody's future and past sacrament papers in terms of not only ordinary versus extraordinary ministers, but also intention is that the general, the unspoken, the unwritten, and maybe written somewhere, but the generally unwritten understanding among apostolic churches is that sacraments are presumed valid. Intention is presumed valid. In other words,
unless you have some very specific reason to know that it's not, which would mean sort of a letter written in advance saying, "I'm planning to screw this sacrament up," right?
Yeah, they're presumed valid unless, so they have to be disproven, not proven. You assume that all the, if somebody doesn't have the documentation, or there isn't a smiling photo of a priest being ordained, and you knew that, say, the mentioned priest and the mentioned bishop actually, have been arguing for years and don't like each other, and somebody turns around and says, well, one ordained the other, then you might have, a bunch of things that create a situation of doubt. But even then, you would say it was doubtful.
Yeah, and in a case of doubtfulness, I think the presumption of validity still stands.
Yeah, until definitively proven.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that it costs us very little to presume to err on the side of generosity in our relationships with other communions. At the end of the day, this is one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and they are as much a member of that greater church that predates the world as we are. And to presume to declare that their activities are somehow invalid, I think is the height of arrogance and something that we need to avoid. There are other traditions of ordination that don't work within this same model, and I think purely for historical purposes, it's worth mentioning a couple of those. And I haven't gone into a whole lot of detail in my research on this, but this is more for an invitation to go do that research yourself. Within the Catholic tradition, the parfait, the perfecti, were ordained via the ritual of the manisola, the laying on of hands. And that seems to bear significant similarities to the practice of ordination into holy orders, but I think is very, very different in important ways. Not the least of which is that when a priest is ordained in the most sacramental churches, the language used is specifically that you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. You can never stop being a priest. That is an indelible and irretrievable mark. The parfait, through a simple lack, a simple failure, ceases to be a parfait and would need to be reordained. And not only, and I found this sort of fascinating, not only would that parfait cease to be a parfait at that moment, but every person to whom they had administered the manisola would in turn cease to be a parfait as well.
A pretty big weight for don't drop the ball.
Yeah, they would need to be, they would all need to be reordained.
It's very different from the Donatus,
Yeah, that's right, the Donatus.
If you were a priest, you did something bad.
Yeah, if you were
Mortal sin.
Father Donald, I don't know if everybody can hear that, but or whether we're getting it on the tape, but I think it's an important point. Among the Donatists, the idea that a priest who fell into sin would cease to be a priest. So that's something that we see in the Catholic tradition as well.
It's where we get the word traitor from, because I think it's traditore. In terms of the Christian clergy who offered incense to the Emperor of Rome, during the persecution. Basically, they were told to do it, or you're in trouble. So those who caved, the Donatists essentially argued that they would need to be reordained, and so as a part of that controversy, that's how the permanence issue, the permanence of orders was settled. Was established, yeah. The other one that I would want to mention, and unfortunately my ignorance is profound on this matter, as it is of so many others, but within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the priesthood is understood in a very, very different way. Of course, as I was coming up the road, there is the beautiful Mormon temple nearby with that glorious gold herald angel, which I'm convinced they buy in bulk because I've seen dozens of. I imagine a sort of wonderful warehouse with just scores of these golden herald angels, and I want to find it. But they distinguish between the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood. And so they sort of further divide orders in their own unique way. And so there are... Father Brant, did you have a...
I was wondering if you could talk about laicization for a moment.
Yeah, return to the lay state. I hadn't really considered it, and I have to admit that I'm a bit fuzzy on that, to be absolutely frank. I mean, the request to return to the lay state seems to me to be fundamentally problematic because of the permanence of the sacrament. I don't know that there is a power that can do that. Now, certainly you can say, well, you no longer have the authorization to act within a particular jurisdiction. But again, that seems to me to be a question of licitness rather than validity. And I think that's where that distinction becomes very, very important. So I'm afraid I'm just going to have to beg off on that, because I don't want to run the risk of making a statement that could be construed as dogmatic out of ignorance. But I would merely say, for my own part, and speaking here strictly for myself, that seems to be, at the very least, to be deeply, deeply problematic. Andre?
In the Roman Catholic tradition, anyway, laicizing of a priest, from what I understand, is very rare. What happens more cases, removal of faculties. So, like, the priest can say his own personal mass, but he can no longer.
But he can no longer function as a priest,
right, publicly, other than for saying the mass for himself.
It's primarily administrative, like, as opposed to something like, say, the annulment of a marriage.
Right.
In that tradition, where they're finding, where essentially, you pay them a lot of money to find a defect in the original.
Right. Yeah, and what you say is that it never actually
took place. In this case, it's simply just.
I mean, I suppose you could do the same thing and search out some defect in the ordination, but I think we're playing games at that point.
I'd also like to qualify my snarky comment about pay the money, because there are
there are
sacramental guarantees, in order to grease the wheels.
And there are
that's documented.
There are legitimate reasons also to seek annulments, and there are legitimate defects, and so on and so forth. So we don't want to be too dismissive, but I don't think that I don't think that the idea of annulments for cash is any big surprise to anybody. That's certainly well established. I mean, it's like talking about indulgences, right? I mean, we all know that happens. So I don't think that that's problematic.
Fundraising opportunity for the AJC? Maybe not.
I can neither confirm nor deny the sale of indulgences within the AJC. So the Sacrament of Holy Orders is vital to the functioning of a sacramental church like the AJC, because it both connects us to the historical apostolic chain, but also connects us to our wider community as deacons and priests and bishops, to the communities we serve. And so I think that both from an historical and also from a theological and practical standpoint, Holy Orders stand as one of the most important of the mysteries, and one that it behooves us to take great care in understanding, and for those of us entrusted with that power in effecting. So I've already addressed a couple of questions, but I know that we have, about 20 minutes that we can answer some more questions as well. So thank you very much. Father Tony.
Thank you, Your Grace. Why haven't you read my book?
Yes, always the first question.
And could you talk a little bit about the ordinary ministers for sacramentals and other rites that are not the 7 sacraments?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, of course, when we use this terminology of the sacraments, we're already sort of verging into the Western practice, because in the Eastern churches, in Orthodoxy, the terminology, of course, is the mysteries, and they are less strictly defined than they are in the Western churches. The AJC follows, of course, the Western model of the 7 sacraments, and but that's really more a matter of sort of organization than anything else. When it comes to sacramentals and other kinds of practices that don't fit precisely into this, but still have important power, I think that there's very much a case-by-case basis. To be sure, most of these, I think, are going to pertain to the operation of the priest, especially when they concern blessing, because blessing is generally a practice of the priesthood. So anything that's going to concern, say, the blessing of a scapular, or the blessing of some sort of object, That is a practice that pertains to the order of the priesthood. Other kinds of sacramentals that may not involve blessing in the same way might pertain to the diaconate. It would be hard for me to think, I'm not going to make a firm statement here, but it would be hard for me to think of a sacramental that would pertain just to the episcopate. I think that would be, at the very least, sort of extremely rare. So I can't think.
Consecration of altar and chalice and paten and things like that.
Oh yeah. You're absolutely right. Good. That's an excellent point.
That can be done by the priest.
Can it?
Yeah, delegated to the priest. Yeah,
I stand corrected.
it's in our sacramentary as such. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I made sure that Father John went home with oil, because he's going to have to consecrate his chalice and paten and altar. But yeah, I mean, everything. I think most sacramentals are tied into blessing. I mean, there's certainly blessed objects, or sacramentalized objects, for lack of a better phrase. For example, things like holy water. The laity can make use of those. For example, I mean, they could use sprinkle holy water in their own home, for example, as part of that. So they could use something that was already been, for lack of a better phrase, empowered by the appropriate order. But generally, the act of empowering all those things.
Yeah. That mojo has to flow through the holy order.
How about exorcism?
It pertains specifically to the order of the priesthood, although we have, of course, this order of exorcist, but that's something different.
It's and largely symbolic.
And so there's. I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's often some confusion about that. Well, I mean, we would never delegate that to a deacon. No, that's just that pertains specifically.
Loosing and binding, so.
I think that's exactly it. That pertains specifically because it is done. And one of the most important things is the priest has to be wearing the stole while doing that, and that's the symbol of the power of the priesthood. So that would be specifically
one thing, though not a sacramental, but one thing that does in terms of tradition and precedence. One thing. Because you mentioned about the deacons proclaiming the gospel, it's enough that, at least in the Roman Catholic tradition, for example, if you had, this is the way it is on paper, I don't know if this is the way they do it in practice, but if there was a Roman Catholic mass here that was presided over by the Pope, or the Pope was present, and there was an ordained deacon in the room, that the privilege of the gospel would go to the deacon before the Pope. Before the Pope would get it, because that's how tied in. You would pass over the Pope in order to give the deacon their proper due.
You can see us occasionally scramble when we're putting together these liturgies, and where everybody's assigned their important parts, and the question is, do we have a deacon? If we've got a deacon, then the gospel goes to them. Automatically.
Which is what we did on Saturday. And it also happened to be John's last act as a deacon. So
right. So hi, Jason.
What happens if someone who's not a priest does an exorcism? I'm talking about exorcism.
It's probably not efficacious.
What do you mean for efficacious?
The purpose of exorcism is to drive away
Yes, I know.
Those influences. My position, again, speaking for myself, I just don't think it would work. I just don't think it would be
effective. Talk to you later about something.
And I think that this has to do, in part, with the distinction, and this is something that's that Mike and I talked about last night, but the distinction between banishing and exorcism. Banishing is something that can be performed by anyone.
Okay.
Exorcism pertains specifically to the power of the priest. And within the ceremonial magic traditions in Britain and on the continent, there is a difference. Those practices that come primarily from the British tradition tend to emphasize banishings. Those that come from the French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian traditions emphasize exorcism. And you'll notice that in many of the cases, the grimoires that come from the continental tradition seem to presume that the operator is a priest.
Okay, now if someone does a banishing, what's the difference between banishing and
It's a subtle difference, and there's been some conversations about this within the occult community. A banishing seems to be more along the lines of an invitation to leave, as opposed to an exorcism, which is a
Get out of my
compulsion
house.
to leave.
Yeah.
I did something like this once with a spirit, and there were some side effects. You know, so maybe I should talk about. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, I don't know if there's enough time to talk about it here.
Yeah, that might be something that we take up afterwards. But
Okay.
I think it's an important distinction. So it's a really important question. Ed Aikens in the back.
I came in a little late, so maybe you guys talked about this, or maybe I just missed it while I spaced out on my lack of coffee this morning. But what about this concept? There was a bit of discussion a couple of years ago that to properly pass on the power of the bishop to consecrate and all this, it has to be done in the proper context.
It is generally, these are always done in the context of the liturgy, but that is not, at least according to our practice, is not a requirement for validity. Because of course, and I didn't talk about sub conditione consecrations, for example, that are occasionally administered outside of the context of the liturgy for the purposes of solidifying apostolic successions. This is a practice, if those of you who may not know this, it's a sort of stand-in for having 3 bishops present for the consecration. It's that after your consecration, you'll encounter other bishops and they will exchange lines between each other as a way of just sort of making sure that everything is sort of solid, making sure that our connection to that historical episcopate is as strong as it can be. And often that is done merely with the imposition of hands. So outside of the context of the liturgy. But in general, unless there is a prevailing interest otherwise, these would always be done within the context of the liturgy. Yeah. Andre?
I know you talked a little bit about like archbishops and things above the episcopacy, but can you talk a little bit about the maybe administrative functionality and also the initiatic quality of, maybe within the context of just the AJC, of like Monsignor and Archpriest?
Yeah, this gets very, very tricky. And in the past, we were a little loose with that, and we were really working very, very hard to be consistent with that. And I'm going to try to make sure that I get this right. An archpriest is somebody that is a denominational function.
Archpriest is diocesan.
It's diocesan. Yeah, I got it backwards.
Yeah.
Archpriest is a diocesan function. So that is something that has to do with the oversight of a number of priests, but not on the overseer, episcopal level, because of course the word episkopos means simply overseer. But so somebody who serves that administrative function, who is sort of in touch with a number of priests. So for example, our deans of the Eastern and Western United States operate in this capacity within the Diocese of Wisconsin, which essentially is coterminous with the United States of America. So that is a purely administrative function. Monsignor is a title that is awarded to priests for their services to the jurisdiction. So those who are carrying out functions that support the AJC as a whole. So for example, priests who are on the Apostolic Council
That's right.
are generally afforded.
Typically, after time, it's not it's not automatic. But there is you mentioned the initiatic end of it. There is something that comes with, in terms of and Monsignor, by the way, we kind of subtitle that Apostolic Prefect.
Apostolic
So
Prefect.
but with the prefects and the archpriests, the one thing that ritually and sacramentally differentiates them from their regular priestly counterparts is that whereas a priest can do confirmation with dispensation from their bishop, an archpriest can do confirmation and minor orders at will without having to ask for
It's essentially,
permission.
they've been given the blanket indulgence from the bishop.
Yeah, to
Right.
do it as
The power,
as
the power still flows from the bishop there.
Yeah,
It's
right.
just that we sort of do it in advance as
and
opposed
the
to.
priest can
on
do
a
minor
case-by-case
orders as well.
basis.
It just takes permission with the archpriest, minor orders and confirmation, because they're essentially, you know, the long arm of the bishop. kind
Yeah,
of.
they're in persona episcopos.
Yeah.
So.
So they are initiatic in nature as well as administrative.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whereas
yeah, there is-
would you say would you say as to reverse that archbishop is more administrative, whereas patriarch might be more initiatory in nature? Or?
Certainly, I think there is a strong initiatic element to the patriarchate. You know, though the patriarch is still just the bishop, just a bishop in terms of holy orders.
Right.
But of course, as the successor to St. John, there's an extraordinary kind of connection that comes along with that. The elevation to archbishop.
It's
It-
almost entirely administrative.
is almost
Yeah.
entirely administrative. It just has to do with more the sort of range of parishes under her oversight. So,
The quantity of priests you've got to somehow keep in line.
yes, yes, yeah.
The extent to which you have to administer the crozier to the backs of arrayed clergy.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I got here a little late. Could you repeat everything?
Yeah, you know, I'll go ahead and tell a story from an academic conference. I attended a paper that was entitled "Is Hegel's Philosophy of History Really Patriarchal?" And it was very, very funny because the presenter started, and he read this question: is Hegel's philosophy of history really patriarchal? Of course it is. Have you read this stuff? It's, you know, it's all from a masculine perspective. And then proceeded to argue very strenuously that this is an inherent part of it. And there was somebody who came in right at the very, very end. And when they opened it up to questions, her hand shot up right away. And she said, I don't understand how you can make the claim that this isn't patriarchal. And she just railed and railed and railed. And nobody could stop her long enough to say, no, that's actually not what he said. So I was thinking it's sort of funny, you know, when people sort of aren't able to be there but then presume to ask these questions. It's always a little funny. Liz.
Probably a simple question.
Oh, those are my
About
favorite.
Unction.
Uh-huh.
So, when you spoke of confession, you said that only a priest can administer confession
Mhm.
because he's allowing you, he's forgiving you for the sins that you want to be forgiven for,
Mhm.
but allowing you to like hold on to the ones that you haven't asked to be forgiven for.
Well, actually, the way that it seems to be phrased, at least as I'm interpreting it, is that power is administered within the scripture. That I say I'm acting as the priest, and you are confessing your sins to me. Those ones I remit, they are remitted. You are freed from those. But if I say, nope, sorry, you're not sufficiently contrite, I bind you to your sin, then you remain bound to that sin. Now, I have a hard time imagining a situation in which a priest would go, nope, sorry, not good enough, I bind you to your sin. But I admit I love the idea, but no, we would never ever do that. That's just my inner sadist coming out there. But so it pertains specifically to the power of the priest to forgive. And so if the priest chooses not to forgive, they are not forgiven.
And how does it work with unction? Because I know you're supposed to be forgiving people for all of their sins. Right?
Yeah. And generally, in the context of the sacrament of reconciliation, there's often a kind of blanket, if you've sort of forgotten to mention something, not that you're willfully withholding it.
Speak,
I'm sorry?
or if I can't speak.
Yeah, if you are, I think again we make an error on the side of generosity there, that we we absolve one of their sins sort of in toto. So even if you haven't mentioned everything, but you're still contrite, then we consider that to be. But if you were intentionally withholding something, then I would think not through the power of the priest, but through your own power would be bound to that sin. So, Andre?
In the liturgy of our Mass, we obviously have that point where there is that that penitentiary rite. Is that, as far as sacramentally, does that fulfill that same sort of sacrament, or no?
I would say that I would say we don't go into distinctions between mortal and venial and those kind of things. And I've always seen it personally as it's not only appropriate to do so for the community, but it's also a way to ensure that everybody that comes up has been properly prepared.
I consider general confession to be valid.
Yes.
No, okay.
Yeah. Short answer to a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I consider general confession, and also I've mentioned this in a couple of instances before, just to get off the subject a little bit, but just to talk about confession. I would never presume to celebrate the liturgy without speaking, without confessing, even if it's just between myself and the divine. And usually the form that it takes is the very traditional, I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have sinned through my most grievous fault. And to ask for forgiveness. Because I think that it's important to be in that state in order to both confess and to receive the Eucharist. And as a result, we do have this general confession, which I think is valid, and it springs from that priestly power. So one last question, Mike.
So, what would be considered a sin within the AJC? I mean,
In 2 words or less.
And on that note, I'm gonna.
we have about 4 minutes before we have to start another talk.
Right, that's why I'm trying to wrap this up, so I'm going to give a very, very brief answer, and this is purely speaking from my own perspective, that a sin is anything that separates us off from the divine. And I think just as a blanket statement, and I leave that, and I think we leave that to the conscience of the individual to determine what kinds of things do that.
I think the magisterium of the church are collectively nodding at this point.
Yes. So thank you guys very, very much. As always, the best part of these talks is the